Why progress starts feeling unsafe. There is a moment when progress stops feeling positive, not because something went wrong, not because the direction is false, but because movement itself starts to feel destabilizing. At first, progress feels good. There is energy, relief, a sense of possibility. You finally begin. You move, you act, you step out of delay. And for a while, this feels like freedom. But then something changes. The very thing you wanted starts creating discomfort. The movement becomes real. The old position begins to loosen. The familiar structure starts to shift. And the system reacts. Not with clear refusal, not always with fear you can name, but with tension. A subtle sense that something is becoming too open, too uncertain, too alive, too difficult to control. This is the point most people misunderstand. They assume that if progress feels bad, something must be wrong. If movement creates tension, the direction must be mistaken. If growth feels unstable, it must not be right. But this is often false. Progress feels unsafe for a very specific reason. It changes the internal structure that your mind has learned to depend on. Even if the old structure was painful, it was known. It had shape, predictability, a logic you already understood. Your patterns may have limited you, but they also organized your experience. They told you who you were, what to expect, how to protect yourself, how to interpret discomfort. Progress interrupts that organization. The moment you begin to move differently, the old map starts losing authority. And that creates a strange kind of insecurity. Not because the new direction is bad, but because the old psychological stability is being disturbed. This is why real progress often feels less like triumph and more like disorientation. You are no longer exactly where you used to be, but you are not yet stabilized in what comes next. The old identity weakens. The new one has not formed. The old reactions are less convincing. The new responses are not yet natural. You are between structures. And between structures, the mind rarely feels safe. It feels exposed. This is why progress can produce symptoms that seem contradictory. You wanted movement. Now movement creates anxiety. You wanted change. Now change feels intrusive. You wanted freedom. Now freedom feels unstable. From the outside, this makes no sense, but internally it is coherent. The system is not only reacting to where you are going, it is reacting to what it is losing. The loss of familiar struggle, the loss of familiar identity, the loss of familiar tension. Even painful patterns create a form of stability. You know how to be yourself inside them. You know how to think there, how to feel there, how to interpret yourself there. Progress removes that certainty. And because certainty disappears, the mind begins to question the movement. Maybe this is too much. Maybe this is not right. Maybe I was better before. Maybe I should slow down. Maybe I should stop. These thoughts often appear not because the progress is false, but because it is working. Something in you is actually moving. Something old is losing its position. Something new is beginning to ask for more space. And that space does not feel familiar yet. This is why many people retreat at the exact point where progress becomes real. Not when they are stuck, when they are actually changing. At first, the mind can enjoy improvement as an idea, as long as it remains light, controlled, and reversible. But when progress starts reorganizing the way you live, the way you feel, the way you see yourself, the nervous system reacts differently. Now the change has consequences. Now something is actually being left behind. Now a previous version of yourself is no longer fully sustainable. That is where the deeper tension begins. Because progress is not only gain, it is also loss. Loss of old defenses, loss of old explanations, loss of old permissions, loss of old excuses, loss of the self that was built around limitation. And even when that self was painful, it was still yours. This is why progress can trigger grief without looking like grief. Restlessness, doubt, sudden fatigue, a desire to pause, a longing for familiar patterns. These are not always signs that you are moving in the wrong direction. Sometimes they are signs that the old structure is no longer able to contain what is emerging. The mind experiences this as danger, not because growth is dangerous, but because growth reduces the power of what used to define you. And anything that reduces an old identity will feel threatening before it feels liberating. This is the paradox. You want the new life, but part of you does not want to lose the old psychological ground. So progress becomes conflict, not between you and the world, between movement and the structure that formed around staying the same. This is why progress starts feeling unsafe, not because it is wrong, but because it is real.
What makes this pattern so persuasive is that it does not feel like fear. It feels like discernment. You think you are being realistic. You think you are noticing something important, a signal, a warning, a reason to slow down. But often, what you are actually noticing is activation, the body responding to the loss of what was familiar. That response is then interpreted as a message. Something is wrong. This is too much. I need to step back. And because the sensation is real, the conclusion feels trustworthy. This is how progress gets misread, not as expansion, as danger. The more meaningful the change, the more likely this becomes. Because small change can still fit inside the old structure. But real change starts reorganizing the way you live. It changes how you think, how you decide, how you relate to yourself, how much of the old identity can still remain in place. That is where resistance intensifies, not because you consciously want to stay the same, but because the system does not yet know how to be safe in what is new. So it reaches backward, toward old rhythms, old thoughts, old emotional positions, not always because they were better, because they were known. And what is known usually feels safer than what is becoming. This is why progress can create a strange temptation to return to the old mood, the old pattern, the old struggle, even when you know it was painful. Because pain with structure often feels easier to hold than freedom without structure. This is the deeper conflict. You are not only moving forward, you are losing the internal architecture that once helped you make sense of yourself. And until something new becomes stable, the mind will often treat movement as risk. This is why growth can feel lonely, not because no one is there, because the version of you that knew how to live inside the old pattern is no longer fully available. That absence can feel like ground disappearing. And when ground disappears, the mind immediately asks for certainty, for proof, for reassurance, for a reason to trust the process. But progress rarely offers that in advance. It asks for continued movement before emotional agreement arrives. That is the part the waiting mind resists. It wants growth to feel safe first, but often growth feels unsafe until it has been lived long enough to become real. This is where the pattern begins to loosen. Not when progress finally feels comfortable, but when discomfort is no longer treated as proof that something is wrong. The feeling of instability does not always mean you should stop. Sometimes it only means that the old structure is no longer in charge. That is what makes progress feel so uncertain. You are no longer held by the familiar, but you are not yet fully rooted in what is new. So the mind looks for a reason to retreat, a reason to pause, a reason to doubt, a reason to return to what already knows you. But once this is seen clearly, the tension changes. It is no longer only fear. It is also transition, not failure, not misalignment. A system learning how to live without the structure that once defined it. This is why progress often feels unsafe before it feels liberating, because first it removes what was familiar. Only later does it become what feels true. And in that in-between, you are asked to continue without the comfort of the old self and without the certainty of the new one. That is the real threshold, not whether movement feels good, whether you can keep moving while part of you still feels unprotected. That is where progress stops being an idea and becomes a lived reality. This is inner cognition.